he's still running the show, might be bringing forth or announcing some indictments. People that we've been hearing him about that he seems to be near to indicting, someone like Roger Stone, for instance. There's been some discussion about the possibility that Don Jr., an indictment might be coming. Don Jr. Trump might be coming shortly. Now, I think there's a lot of question about whether an indictment, it's the case that, if there are indictments that the grand jury already has under seal, it may be the case that Whitaker cannot stop those indictments from coming forward. It would take an extraordinary act for him to go back to the court and try to undo those indictments if they are sitting out there. So it's possible that even though Whitaker can undermine the Mueller investigation in various ways, and that's obviously what Donald Trump wants him to do, it's also possible that there are indictments that are out there under seal. And is it possible that we might see one of those or more of those tomorrow? I would not be surprised if we did.
Which is why we tell people to stay tuned, and it looks like Heilman wins Scrabble with emboldenment. John Heilman, Kimberly Atkins, Barbara McQuaid, our great thanks for starting off our broadcast tonight. Coming up for us after our first break, a deeper look at with Jeff Sessions out and Acting Attorney General Mark Whitaker now overseeing the special counsel, we are getting new reporting tonight on where the Mueller-Russia investigation may stand. Politico reports that according to Rudy Giuliani, and that would mean we're under a mandatory caveat warning, Trump and his attorneys are, quote, planning to meet next week to decide whether to submit any of their written responses to special counsel Robert Mueller about what Trump might have known about Russian hacking during the 2016 campaign. Giuliani added the president's lawyers have prepped answers for Trump to review, but have made no final decision about sending them on to Mueller. Politico goes on to report, quote, based on the questions Mueller delivered to the president's lawyers, Giuliani said he would be surprised if the special counsel wasn't already writing at least a final report dealing with topics related to the Trump campaign and the Russian hackers. We repeat, mandatory caveat warning. With us to talk about it all, Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, who in the past has worked for, among others, one Robert Mueller, and Chuck Rosenberg, a former senior FBI official, also a former U.S. attorney. So, Frank, what do you think is happening with Robert Mueller behind the scenes? What tea leaves have you traditionally looked for that have steered you correctly in this investigation?
Well, I've got a theory, Brian, and it's just a theory, but perhaps Bob Mueller has already indicated to us what he's going to do. And by that I mean, it's possible that since Mueller has given us indictment after indictment that tell us very detailed stories of what happened, more detail than you ever usually see in indictments of this nature, perhaps that's a strategy. Perhaps what we'll see is Bob Mueller telling us the story of a corrupt president through indictments. And you say, well, indictments of who? I think the Whitaker appointment steps up the timeline. And I think perhaps if Mueller sticks to this strategy of telling us the story through indictments, the indictments speak to us, that he'll speak to us soon, very soon, with additional indictments, perhaps that tell the story of a corrupt president. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to go the route of filing a report. I think he will. I think that's pretty traditional, and he'll do that. But I think he'll choose what he's comfortable.
Now, we appear to have lost the satellite connection between us and Frank Figliuzzi. Do we still have Chuck Rosenberg on the line? We do, I'm told. Okay, Chuck, please stand by. I'm going to read you as we try to effort getting our comms back with Frank. Let me read you this out of Vanity Fair. This just hit. In recent days, according to 3 sources, Don Jr. has been telling friends he is worried about being indicted. As early as this week, one person close to Don Jr. speculated that Mueller could indict him for making false statements to Congress and the FBI about whether he had told his father about the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Russians to gather dirt on Hillary Clinton. I think that's what you lawyers call legal exposure, Chuck.
That's legal exposure, Brian. And by the way, I don't think Frank Figliuzzi, and I hope he rejoins us because he's a lot smarter than me or you or any of our friends, have ever spent a day in their lives telling their friends, that they expected to be indicted. I mean, that's just a remarkable thing to say. What would prompt someone to say that, Brian? Well, I think it's rather simple. And like Frank, I also have a theory. I would imagine that Donald Trump Jr.'s lawyer has been in constant contact with prosecutors. And so perhaps they've told him to expect this, and he, of course, has told his client. Whether or not that turns out to be true, we'll see. But I can tell you, friends, you're about to be indicted unless you know something is coming. It's more than a premonition.
Frank, you missed it. We said nothing but great things about you while you were gone electronically. But let me ask you this. Those of us who spent any time in corporate America or civil service are used to the phrase short timer. And you used affectionately the phrase in talking with one of our producers tonight about Bob Mueller. What did you mean? What context did you put that in?
Oh, I think his days are numbered. I think this is a blatant attempt by the appointment of Whitaker is a blatant attempt by the president to make Mueller go away in the form of either removing him or greatly constraining his mandate or funding. So Mueller knows that. He's been there, done that. He's prepared for this, and that's why when we had lost our satellite feed, I was explaining, I think he's ready to indict some folks, and through those indictments, we'll tell the story of what he's found against the president. I'm not saying he's indicting the president. I'm saying there's a middle ground where he tells us the story, locks it into the court system by indicting others, then files a report with Whitaker. Whitaker can look very partisan by refusing to release the report. Congress can subpoena it. There can be this battle going on. But while that battle's going on, the indictments of others that tell us the story of Trump are sitting in the court system.
Chuck, I'm not going to ask you to pass judgment on the appointment of Mr. Whitaker, who, like you, is a former U.S. attorney, but I am going to ask you for a definition. We've already used this phrase, constitutional crisis, once on the broadcast, and we're hearing it on a daily basis in this country now. For folks who may not have as much mileage on them as the three of us do, sharing a generation, define it, not whether this rises to it, but define what a constitutional crisis is, and do you know it when you see it?
Yeah, I think there's a fairly narrow definition of a constitutional crisis properly told, Brian, and that sometimes it's used in a hyperbolic way. A constitutional crisis, for instance, and I forget which presidents were at issue. It might have been Polk, but I know people will check me on this. A constitutional crisis occurs, let's say, when a president dies in office, and you don't know whether his successor is the president or an acting president, meaning the Constitution literally doesn't answer the question. There is no answer. And so I don't know that we're in a constitutional crisis defined that way. I think we are in uncharted waters. I'm concerned about it. I think about what might happen every day to my beloved Department of Justice. I also have something that keeps me grounded, and I think Frank will agree with this. The men and women of the FBI, of the Department of Justice, the career prosecutors and agents are still doing their work, and I've told you this before. That gives me great comfort. I hope that the gravitational pull of the Department of Justice is such that even Matt Whitaker sort of feels the weight of his new job, feels the gravity, if you will, of the new job, and that it moves him in the way it moves all of us in the department toward the norm, toward the rule of law. That's what gives me hope. I think describing it right now as a constitutional crisis is a bit hyperbolic.
Thank you for that. Okay, get comfortable. This is important. Just over 50 hours after the polls closed in Arizona, we have a new leader in the Senate race there. After the latest count, the Democrat Kyrsten Sinema is now leading Republican Martha McSally after trailing for the better part of these last 2 days, but there are still, this is a huge number, over 500,000 outstanding ballots to be counted in Arizona. It's a huge vote by mail state, and they're dealing with tremendous volume. In Florida, Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson has moved within 0.5% of Governor Rick Scott. The narrow gap likely will trigger an automatic recount. Earlier tonight, however, Governor Scott accused Democratic county officials of working to swing the results against him.
We've all seen the incompetence and the irregularities in vote tabulations in Broward and Palm Beach for years. Well, here we go again. I will not sit idly by while unethical liberals try to steal this election from the great people of Florida.
And, oh, look, he's getting air support from the White House. Just a while ago, the president added this on Twitter. Law enforcement is looking into another big corruption scandal having to do with election fraud in Broward and Palm Beach. Florida voted for Rick Scott. That's the president of the United States. The Florida governor's race is now also within the margin for a recount, but because the Democrat Andrew Gillum conceded, our network's designation stands as apparent winner for Ron DeSantis. In the state next door, Republican Brian Kemp resigned today as Georgia Secretary.